The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 5th chapter. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt it in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord. A healing story contained within another healing story. A woman and a girl in need of healing, with very different stories, coming from very different backgrounds with different approaches. Perhaps you could even say one was privileged and one was not. First, the 12-year-old girl. She was the daughter of Jairus, a leader of the synagogue. That tells us something. If he was a leader, that meant he had connections. That meant that he had power and influence in the community. He could probably pull strings for Jesus, help him with his ministry, convince the other synagogue leaders that he wasn't the rabble-rouser that people painted him to be. Jairus had privilege, and his daughter is not well. It is an emergency. She doesn't look good, and he is fearful that she might not make it to see a 13th year. Jairus makes a request of Jesus to come place his hands on her, and Jesus agrees. Next is the woman with the hemorrhage for 12 years. She does not come from the same place of privilege that we know of. In fact, quite the opposite. The woman's hemorrhage would have made her ritually unclean. She was restricted in where she could be, who she could touch, and what she could do. The religious laws put strict controls on what her life could look like. She was subject to a patriarchal and archaic understanding of how her body was allowed to be in the world. The church has continued this practice of placing restrictions and boxes around people. Some want to limit people by choosing for them who they can love, or how they can act, or what they can say. The woman had reached out for medical help, but they were not helpful. She was probably labeled as a medical mystery and subjected to experiments, not knowing how to treat her. She spent more than just money searching for a cure. She spent her whole life. Her whole identity was wrapped up around this condition that plagued her. She doesn't know if she can withstand the shame and heartache and stress of this condition for a 13th year. She was forced to accept others' interpretation of her own condition. We are often forced to do the same, consenting to the restrictions that others place on our life. The disciples functioned in this way for Jesus, forming a barrier around him as he traveled. They may have thought they were keeping Jesus safe or keeping him on task, but in reality, they were restricting others from having access to him, limiting who was worthy of Jesus' healing touch. There were needs all around, but they didn't want to see or notice who was right under their noses. Even more, she was risking humiliation and rejection by Jesus. For her to touch him was to also make Jesus ritually unclean. She knew that if Jesus realized he had been touched, then he would potentially become angry and reject her for the inconvenience. It was risky for her to attempt to be near him, but she was desperate. This was probably her last shot at a miracle, and to protect herself, she wanted to do this discreetly by sneaking close and only touching the edge of his clothes. With one touch, she goes from outsider to daughter. Jesus elevates her to the highest level. She is placed above the crowd, above the disciples, all the way up to the point of being inside Jesus' own family. She is claimed. She is told that she belongs. She is noticed for who she is and not just the condition that has labeled her for 12 long years. She is named with respect. She is named with affection. 12 years is a long time to wait. Sometimes things feel like they will never change. Then, all of a sudden, after endless waiting, everything changes. Life is restored. And just as quickly, life can be lost. It seems that the disruption of the woman has delayed Jesus from getting to Jairus' daughter on time. She's dead. For a moment, it seems that Jesus can't be all things to all people in all places. He got sidetracked, and this family is now mourning. Death appears to win. But Jesus is not deterred. He keeps going, saying that she is only asleep. And when he arrives, he risks another ritual impurity, touching a dead body. The contact of both the woman and the girl each would render Jesus ritually unclean. And he doesn't care. It doesn't stop him from restoring life in either case. The labels placed on you by others do not stop Jesus. Whether your life has been in turmoil for years or you're just now experiencing a great loss, Jesus is not deterred. Whether you think you've strayed too far and done the unforgivable, Jesus is not deterred. Don't daughter, little girl, precious child, your faith has made you well. Get up. Amen.